The tugs nudged her against the pier just after dawn, 90,000 tons of warship easing into Pier 12 at Norfolk under a sky still gray with mist. From the shoreline, it looked like any other homecoming. Families on the apron. White uniforms in formation. The unmistakable silhouette of CVN-78, the USS Gerald R. Ford, settling into the berth she had earned after a deployment that stretched longer than anyone in the Pentagon had originally authorized. But inside the carrier's island, the mood was not the mood of a homecoming. It was the mood of an aircraft that had landed with warning lights still flashing. Because within 72 hours of arrival, the most expensive warship ever constructed would be torn open. Hangar bay panels removed. Reactor compartments accessed. Catapult systems pulled apart. Radar arrays uncoupled. And the Navy would do all of it under a level of urgency that does not appear in any public statement. The official language called it a maintenance availability. The reality was something closer to a forensic examination. Because Ford had come home carrying something the Navy had not anticipated. Not damage. Not failure. Something more uncomfortable than either. She had come home carrying data. The deployment had pushed her systems harder than any peacetime cruise in a generation. Sustained flight operations in the eastern Mediterranean. Repositioning into the Red Sea corridor during a window when Houthi anti-ship missiles and one-way attack drones were saturating the maritime approaches to Bab el-Mandeb. Extended station keeping off the Levant during a period when every intelligence cell from Naples to Tampa was watching for a second front that never quite materialized, but never quite dissolved either. And through all of it, Ford's electromagnetic catapults, her advanced arresting gear, her dual-band radar, her weapons elevators, every system that had once been the source of congressional frustration, were being measured against the only standard that actually matters. Not the test range. Not the shakedown. Combat tempo. And that is where the visible story ends and the hidden one begins. Because what the crew brought back to Norfolk was not just a ship. It was a dataset. Sortie generation rates under threat conditions. Catapult cycle times under sustained launch pressure. Radar performance against low observable drone profiles the system was never originally designed to prioritize. Weapons elevator endurance under magazine flow rates that the original specifications had quietly assumed would never be sustained for this long. And somewhere inside that dataset were answers the Navy needed before the next carrier rotation crossed the Atlantic. Answers that could not wait for a normal maintenance cycle. So they tore her apart. A senior maintenance officer at the shipyard, speaking in the flat cadence of someone who has seen too many surprises to be surprised again, described the pace simply. The availability was compressed. The work packages were expanded. And the priority list had been rewritten somewhere above his pay grade. That last detail is the one that matters. Because when priority lists get rewritten above the shipyard level, it usually means the timeline is no longer being driven by the ship. It is being driven by something the ship is expected to do next. And the next deployment window is closer than the public schedule suggests. Consider the geometry. The Eisenhower Strike Group is in its post-deployment reset, its air wing rotating personnel, its escorts cycling through their own maintenance phases. The Truman is operating under constraints that the Navy has not publicly detailed, but that anyone tracking her movements over the past year can infer. The Nimitz is in the twilight of her service life, every cruise now measured against the calendar of her inevitable decommissioning. The Reagan is repositioning. The Washington is still working through her own post-overhaul certifications. And the Lincoln, Vinson, Roosevelt, and Stennis are each locked into rotations that the Pacific demand signal will not allow to slip. Which means the carrier the Navy can actually surge, on short notice, into a contested theater is a shorter list than the fleet's official numbers suggest. And Ford is on that list. That is the pressure underneath the pier-side ceremony. That is why the work began before the brow was fully secured. That is why technicians from Newport News were already aboard before the last family had left the apron. The Navy is not repairing a carrier. The Navy is reconstituting an option. The question is what that option is for. Look at the deployment patterns of the last 6 months and a shape begins to emerge. Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic has reached levels that quietly echo the early 1980s, with Severodvinsk-class boats conducting patrols that extend further west and stay deeper than the public acknowledgments suggest. Chinese carrier operations in the Western Pacific have moved from familiarization exercises to sustained blue water rehearsals, with the Fujian working through catapult trials that mirror the technology Ford was built around. Iranian fast attack craft are operating in geometries that suggest coordination with land-based anti-ship missile batteries along the southern Iranian coast. And in the Red Sea, the Houthi missile and drone inventory has not been depleted by months of interception. It has been refined. Every one of those threat vectors is a problem Ford was designed to address. And every one of them is a problem that has evolved faster than the platform's original threat model anticipated. That is the uncomfortable subtext of what is happening at Pier 12. The teardown is not just maintenance. It is recalibration. The Navy is checking whether the assumptions baked into Ford during her design phase, 2 decades ago, still hold against the threat environment she will sail back into. And in some areas, the answer appears to be no. Take the air wing. Ford deployed with a composition that looked traditional on paper. F/A, 18 Super Hornets. EA, 18G Growlers. E-2D Hawkeyes. MH, 60 helicopters. CMV, 22B Ospreys for logistics. But the operational reality on station was different. The air wing spent a disproportionate amount of its sortie generation on defensive counter-air, on overwatch, on intercept missions against threats that 20 years ago would not have existed at all. Slow, cheap, expendable drones. Cruise missiles fired from non-state actors. Loitering munitions launched from shorelines that no one had previously considered missile-capable. The carrier's offensive striking power, the entire reason the platform exists, was rationed against the defensive demand signal. And the magazine depth of the escorts was the variable that nobody outside the strike group commander's stateroom was tracking in real time. A surface warfare officer who served on one of Ford's escorts described it with characteristic understatement. The interceptors held. The launchers held. The crews held. But the math was tightening. Every SM-2, every SM-6, every ESSM expended against a drone worth a few $1,000s was a round that would not be available for a higher-end threat. And the resupply chain for those interceptors is not a chain that scales quickly. The production lines exist. The throughput does not. That is the logistics vulnerability underneath the visible deterrence posture. And it is one of the reasons Ford's teardown matters beyond the ship itself. Because if the next deployment cycle is going to ask the same air wing and the same escort screen to absorb the same defensive load, the platform has to be capable of generating sorties at rates that compensate for the magazine pressure. The catapults have to cycle faster. The arresting gear has to reset cleaner. The weapons elevators have to move ordnance from magazine to flight deck at a tempo that the original specifications treated as an upper bound, not a baseline. So the technicians at Newport News are not just inspecting systems. They are tuning them for a tempo that was once theoretical and is now operational. And somewhere in that recalibration is the hidden variable that changes the entire equation. Because Ford is not the only asset being repositioned in this quiet way. While the carrier sits open at Pier 12, other movements are occurring with less visibility. Virginia-class submarines are shifting patrol assignments in patterns that intelligence analysts in Allied capitals have begun to notice. Forward-deployed P-8 Poseidon squadrons are flying tracks that suggest a renewed emphasis on undersea queuing in the GI-UK gap. Air Force tanker assets are being prepositioned at bases that would shorten the response time to either the Eastern Mediterranean or the Western Pacific, depending on which way the next crisis tips. And the Marine Corps is rotating amphibious-ready groups through training cycles that compress their workup timeline by weeks. None of these movements, taken individually, would draw attention. Together, they form a posture. And the posture is not the posture of a fleet in peacetime reset. It is the posture of a fleet that expects to be asked to do something on short notice and is quietly removing the friction that would slow that response. Ford is the centerpiece of that posture. Which is why she is being torn apart with the urgency of a race against a clock no one is allowed to see. The clock is the part that should make any serious observer pause. Because the timing of major naval reconstitution efforts has historically correlated, in ways that are visible only in hindsight, with the timing of strategic decisions made far above the level of the shipyard. In 1990, the surge maintenance on multiple carriers preceded Desert Shield by a margin that looked coincidental at the time and looks deliberate now. In 2002, similar patterns appeared before the Iraq invasion. In 2011, the quiet acceleration of certain availabilities preceded the Libya intervention by a window that was, again, dismissed as routine until the operations began. The pattern is not predictive, but it is suggestive. And the current pattern is suggestive in a direction that the Pentagon has not chosen to articulate publicly. The strategic ambiguity is intentional. It is also, for anyone watching the indicators, increasingly thin. Consider what Ford's accelerated availability actually buys. If the work packages compress as the schedule suggests, the carrier could be available for surge tasking weeks earlier than her normal cycle would permit. That window aligns, with uncomfortable precision, with several geopolitical inflection points that intelligence cells across the Five Eyes community have been tracking. The Taiwan electoral and political calendar. The Iranian succession dynamics. The Russian winter offensive cycle in Ukraine. The Korean Peninsula's quiet but persistent escalation in missile testing tempo. Any one of these could become the event that demands a carrier on station within a timeline that the normal fleet rotation cannot meet. And that is the moment the hidden variable matters most. Because Ford, refurbished and retuned, becomes the carrier the Navy can move when no one else expects it. A retired strike group commander, asked about the pace of the Norfolk work, offered an observation that lingered. Carriers are not just platforms. They are signals. And the way you maintain a carrier tells you what kind of signal you expect to send next. The Ford availability, in that framing, is not a maintenance event. It is a preparation. The Navy is sharpening the edge of the option before the option is required. Whether that option is ever exercised is the question the public will not learn the answer to in advance. But the preparation itself is the message. To allies, it says the capability is closer than the schedule suggests. To adversaries, it says the timeline they may have been counting on does not exist. To the fleet itself, it says the next deployment is not a possibility on the horizon. It is a probability on the calendar. And underneath all of it sits the larger question that no one in uniform will answer directly. What did Ford actually encounter during the deployment that justified this pace? Because shipyards do not compress availabilities for routine wear. They compress them when something in the operational data demands it. Whether that something is a vulnerability that must be closed, a capability that must be enhanced, or a threat that has evolved faster than the platform was designed to counter, the answer is buried inside the work packages now being executed at Pier 12. And the work packages are not public. What is public is the geometry. A carrier home from a deployment that tested her harder than the Navy expected. A shipyard moving with a tempo that the official language does not explain. A fleet posture that is quietly shedding friction. A threat environment that is evolving in directions the original design assumptions did not anticipate. And a strategic calendar with multiple inflection points clustered inside a window that aligns, with discomforting precision, against the moment Ford will be ready to sail again. The visible story is a maintenance availability. The hidden story is a clock. And the clock is running faster than the pierside photographs suggest. Somewhere in the dark water beyond the Chesapeake, a Virginia-class submarine slipped its moorings days ago and has not been heard from since. Somewhere over the North Atlantic, a P-8 squadron is flying tracks that the public flight trackers do not display. Somewhere in a windowless room at Naval Operations, a planner is looking at a map and a calendar and a list of carriers, and the list is shorter than the map requires. And somewhere inside CVN-78, technicians are working through the night on systems that will determine, in a way that no press release will ever capture, whether the United States Navy can keep its options open in the months ahead. Ford came home looking like a homecoming. She is being prepared like a departure. And the next time she clears the Virginia Capes, the world she sails into will not be the world she left. If this is the kind of analysis you want more of, the kind that looks past the photographs and into the geometry underneath, subscribe and stay with the channel. There are more layers to this story, and the next one is already moving.